Policy Forum, featuring three distinguished colleagues who have recently returned from trips to Iraq and conducting high-level meetings, but also on-the-ground conversations with shapers and influencers of Iraqi politics. The timing could not have been better because Iraq seems to be always at a crossroad, and this one is not an exception. The country has recently had an election that was supposed to result into forming a new government. That government is not in sight yet because we have two hindrances in the way. One of them is a recount that is still ongoing because the poll was marred with accusations of fraud and ballot rigging. So there's a recount process going on there on the one hand. On the other, protests broke out in southern Iraq in many of the cities in the, especially the oil-rich city in Basra, among others, against the government for lack of basic services, including potable water and electricity. And this is very important to put in context because Basra's heat was 122, and some of these towns, in fact, broke international. They were the hottest cities in the world when these protests happened. So that's just the setting for today's conversation. And of course, there's a lot going on in terms of government formation, the relationship between the KRG and Baghdad, the Iranian influence in this process and in these relationships. And to discuss all of these, we're very fortunate to have, as I mentioned, three distinguished analysts and Iraq watchers. To my left is Genevieve Abdu. She is a resident scholar at the Arabia Foundation. She's also the author of 4 books on the Middle East, the most recent of which is The New Sectarianism, the Arab Uprisings, and the Rebirth of the Shia-Sunni Divide. I should point out that Genevieve is a veteran journalist, and she was the first American journalist to be based in Iran since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Our second, to her left, our second guest is Nusayba Yunus, who is an associate fellow at the Chatham House, who is also serving as a senior advisor to the European Institute on Peace, where she is advising high-level mediation efforts in Iraq. She previously directed the task force on the future of Iraq, which was chaired by Ambassador Ryan Crocker, which was a program in the Atlantic Council. And of course, to her left is my colleague here at the Institute, Mike Knights, who is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute, who specializes in the military and security affairs of Iraq, Iran, and the Gulf states. He has worked extensively with the local military and security agencies in Iraq, the Gulf state, and now increasingly in Yemen. I should point out that this meeting is on the record. We're actually streaming live. For the first 45 minutes, I'll be asking a round of quick questions on issues of the elections and the government formation, the KRG-Baghdad relationships, security and the potential return of ISIS or reemergence of ISIS as an insurgency, and the implications of all of these issues to U.S. policy. But before I get to these topics, and welcome back from your long trips, I hope you're not jet-lagged, I wanted to start with one question to all three of you, and maybe I can get short answers to this. What was the most surprising or strongest insight that you got and you picked up on this trip to Iraq? Let's start with Genevieve.
Well, I think that, you know, when you visit most Middle East countries or you live there, the sort of reality on the ground is always very different than the prevailing narratives in Washington. And so it's not that surprising that, you know, you receive completely different information. But I would say that just briefly, I mean, one thing that really struck me was that most people I met all said immediately that the election was illegitimate. And I thought that that was somewhat surprising. I mean, they said that they thought the election was illegitimate because, in fact, only 20% of the electorate voted, not 40%, that there was widespread fraud. And so I was very surprised at how candid people were. I mean, even top government officials were saying this. And I guess the other thing that really impressed me was just the profound interference and involvement of Iran in not only the economy of Iraq and most of what we know, but in the electoral process itself and its aftermath. And so I received a lot of firsthand information about the sort of details and the strategy that the Iranians are pursuing, either through their own officials or through their loyalists inside Iraq. Mm-hmm. So I would say those are sort of the two issues that I came away with that were quite impressive. But I guess the third thing would be that I was, here we sort of have come to believe, I think, that Iraq is on the road to progress. That this was the first election since the defeat, no longer the defeat, but I would say the de-escalation of ISIS in the country. But I think we're a long way from declaring that the country's on the road to progress, unfortunately. So I don't know if my colleagues agree with this, but I think that there are serious problems with the economy, with society in general, with the military, the lack of strength within a central government. So I think that we're a long way from sort of declaring that Iraq is on the road to progress, unfortunately. So those were sort of my initial impressions.
Ms. Ava, what did you hear?
So what I was most surprised to see is the gap in perception between the kinds of people who have been out protesting on the streets and between senior government officials in Iraq, in Baghdad. And I was somewhat shocked and certainly disappointed that given the scale of the protests, given the level of anger that was very clearly on display, given actually the level of violence that was evident in the protests, and the fact that the protests were coming after such a clear display of distrust in the Iraqi electoral system, with this very low turnout in the elections, that given that kind of sequence of events and the scale of anger and disillusionment that is very clearly present on the street, what I had been expecting to see was an Iraqi political class, and I met with political leaders from across the country, from all of the different components of the Iraqi ethno-sectarian landscape. What I'd been expecting to see was some nervousness, a sense that maybe this country's at a crossroads, that the stability of the political order is being threatened, and that there is something dramatic and drastic and substantive that they would need to do in order to restore trust in the electoral system, to restore trust in the political process, and to demonstrate to Iraqis that there would be a way to participate in Iraqi politics in a non-violent way through democratic means that led to actual change. That there is a way to participate that does produce positive reform, such as is being very clearly demanded. And what you should have been able to see this year is Iraqis going to the polls to make clear what they wanted to see different. And what they've chosen to do instead is not go to the polls, but go to the streets, because they don't believe that participating in the election produces the change that they require. And what I've seen from the Iraqi political class, and this is across the board pretty much, is a sense that they can get through this because they've got through it before. We did see very substantial protests in 2011 in Iraq that were also pretty brutally put down. There's a sense that this will pass. Yes, there is an explosion of popular anger. It's happened before. It will happen again. But there's just no real intention, certainly no substantial planning, to tackle the deep-rooted issues that have given rise to this dysfunctional state. And so, what they're talking about is doing some small things on the margins that aren't going to make a big difference. And they're not really engaging with the core threat that's implicit in the current state of affairs.
I see. Michael, you had quite extensive meetings, including with the Prime Minister. What shocked you?
So a couple of things were, interesting and really stood out. One is that, there's a very different view outside Iraq of the relative balance of power in the next parliament than you will find within the Iraqi political elite itself. People might look at Hyder al-Abadi's Nasser bloc and say that has the third largest number of seats with 42, but most people within the political system understand that he himself, the Prime Minister, controls as few as 6 or 9 maybe, and that coalition will implode the moment it has to start spending its points on buying ministries. So, for instance, in Iraq, usually you get 1 point for every 3 seats you have in the 329-seat parliament, and the Prime Ministership will cost, between 12 and 15. And as a result, only a couple of blocks have got enough seats to actually buy the premiership out. I mean, one really has got enough to buy their premiership, 2 maybe outright. But to do so, they would have to not buy any ministries for anybody else in their movement. And of course, they often have, secondary and tertiary leaders within these blocks that are fully expected to get a ministry. And so Prime Minister Abadi's list would be a classic example. If they bought the premiership, which they're not going to do, everyone else in that bloc would get shafted and they would quickly abandon him. So a lot of the blocks look a lot different when you look under the hood than they do from the outside. From my perspective, this election, everybody understands that it was a pretty crushing defeat for Dawa, crushing defeat across both the Prime Minister's side of the movement and Vice President Maliki's side of the movement. I think the core parties in the centre of this government formation process are likely to be Sairun and Hikmah, 2 cohesive blocks that really control their members. Even Fatah coalition with Badr and Asayib al-Haq at its centre, are really kind of split along a number of different lines. So the final political finding for me was that it's amazing how quickly the Barzanis have bounced back inside Baghdad. I expected there to be a lot of residual anger and blame game stuff going on, and there is that under the surface. But when they look now at Masoud Barzani, many of the Iraqi power brokers see a guy who truly does have at least 26 seats, full control over those 26, a strong leader who has the loyalty of his base. And so even though there's a lot of residual sour grapes about the referendum, being that the Barzanis have signalled they want to play a more important role in Baghdad, being that they've signalled that they want the Iraqi federal presidency and to use that in its constitutional prerogatives to open up a debate with Baghdad, a longer-running debate, so that the Kurdish bargain that they're seeking will not simply be an event once every 4 years, quadrennial event, and then they get disappointed, but actually an ongoing process. I think that there's some interesting opportunities coming up for the Kurds much faster than I would have expected after the referendum and the fall of Kirkuk. That's politics. On US-Iraq role, I'll say that it's very Iraqi leaders understand that they can't just go back to a pre-2011 relationship with the US, and they'll talk about how it perhaps shouldn't become. There should be no kind of default fallback to a permanent US military presence, including a combat role. But they also don't want the kind of the neglectful, hollow relationship of 2011 to 2014. Nor is the full combat operations model of 2014 through to 2018. What we need is something new between the two countries. And, when you speak to them about this, they talk about a well-defined, delimited security cooperation framework. They want the US to be flexible on Iraq's soft confrontation of its militias at a time frame and in a way that works for Iraq. They want the US to be thoughtful on implementation of sanctions on Iran in a way that doesn't hurt Iraq, let's say by, knocking 1.5 million megawatts out of circulation, and they want there to be flexibility on who the next prime minister is. They don't want the US coming to Baghdad and giving the sense that only one man can do the job. And finally, they want new faces. They want to see new US faces in Baghdad, and they make that pretty explicit. So I think, Iraq wants us to be patient, and the US, from what I can tell over here, is increasingly moving towards a mentality of either a bull in a china shop or nothing. Let's fix this Iranian influence, let's get some buy-in from these Iraqis, or let's just end this, this charade, this expensive military engagement, this treating Iraq as a different kind of ally because of our historic experience together. I think Washington and Baghdad are really out of sync right now, and I think there's a lot of danger of pushing Iraq towards Iran, or at least away from America. Or alternatively, if we were smart enough, there would be an opportunity for a very new kind of relationship now. And I've been sort of mentioning that the odd time in closed circle briefings, and it sometimes gets a negative reaction, as if it's saying the US should step back from involvement in Iran, or should not play the traditional role that it plays to offset in Iraq, or should not play the role it plays to offset Iranian influence. I'm not saying that, but I think this is a new era, and we should have a new kind of relationship with Iraq.
I'll get back to asking you maybe later on about what specifically should that new relationship that you're prescribing, Mike, should be built on, and what it should look like. But let's maybe step back a little bit and refocus on what's making headlines. And Genevieve, you mentioned the protests. And then, of course, Nusayba also mentioned that this is a protest against weak governance, the inability of the political elite to deliver services and deliver economic development and job creation. There's this mismatch between what the elections have given the society and what the society actually needs and wants. How are we going to bridge this gap? And what can the United States do to help bridging that gap? Genevieve.
Well, it is a huge gap, as Nusayba talked about in some detail. And what I think is what the Iraqi people, and I interviewed some people also who were part of the protest movement, and that's really to some degree how Sadr got some sort of popular mobilization going, is that people trusted that he could deliver on a different kind of, form of governance, that he could deliver services, that he could solve some of these problems. And of course, a lot of their anger and disappointment has also been that they are frustrated in the aftermath of the election, seeing that, he's now called for a halt to the process of the government formation until the protests start. So they're not seeing that he's delivering on his campaign promises or that he's moving in that direction. Nobody really knows what direction he's moving in. And so I think that that's part of the anger and the frustration that we're seeing on the streets, is that even those who did vote, even those who are with Sadr in the, fairly, I wouldn't, at least from my experience there, I wouldn't say it was a widespread protest movement. I mean, there are protests now in Basra and other places over specific issues. But the protest movement that he was part of, I wouldn't say, at least at the time before the elections, it was quite widespread the way we're seeing now. To answer your question, yes, I think the United States can play a very positive role in trying to improve, the lack of strength within the central government. And I think that this is a way that, in all countries of the Middle East, not just in Iraq, that the United States can turn a different page, as Michael was saying, and create a different relationship with an Arab state that doesn't involve just political involvement or military involvement, but actually includes providing services, providing, kinds of social services that the government can't provide for one reason or the other. I mean, in the case of the electricity situation, of course, that was an Iranian decision. And a delegation from Iraq did go to Tehran recently, and they couldn't really resolve this with the Iranians. So they're sort of, really stuck now. I mean, how do they resolve this problem? And there doesn't seem to be any sort of aid coming in this direction from the United States. So I think that this is one way, as Michael stated, that we could create a different kind of relationship with the Iraqis if that were to happen.
Nusayba, following up on this question of government formation and the sort of driving forces behind it, you all talked about the elections and the fragmentation within the Sunni Kurdish Shia houses, the mismatch, as I mentioned earlier, between what the public want and what the politicians can deliver. But how about the external drivers? Iran on one hand, the United States on the other. In a recent piece that you wrote for Reuters, you mentioned how, the main source of Iranian power is within the Shia coalition as an underwriter of those coalitions. How can we match then these two dynamics? A public that's angry and protesting, not as a Sunni or ISIS, but it's a Shia population against the Shia government. And again, we also saw protests earlier this year by the Kurdish population against their own Kurdish government. So this anger, not at a sect, not at the political party, but at the government system, at the political elite. How is the government formation going to deal with these two different dynamics? A angry public on one hand, and then external influences that are not necessarily attuned to the demands of the public.
Yeah, so what's happened is that the political elite in Iraq is facing these challenges across the board, challenges to all of them for their misrule, for the lack of delivery, on promises they've made in campaign after campaign and have never delivered on. But the Iraqi political elite is kind of a step removed from really hearing those demands and from changing their political behavior with each other according to those pressures from outside. And just to give you a little bit of an insight into why it's so difficult for these politicians to respond adequately, what you have in Iraq is essentially this appalling Ba'athist super bureaucracy that's been overlaid with a massive patronage system. So what you have is each of these Iraqi political leaders doesn't really believe that they are corrupt, and they don't really believe that they are responsible for why services are not being delivered. So when you ask them to take responsibility and to pursue change, they say, well, it isn't us. I mean, it's not us. We're not stealing from the state. I mean, obviously, when there is a procurement process in a ministry, our political party takes a cut, just as every political party takes a cut, because if we didn't do that, then how would we pay for the families of the martyrs in the areas where we live? How would we pay for scholarships for the local families? They see this kind of what we would describe as straightforward corruption and theft from the state. They see that as part of governing. They think they're governing by doing that because they think of themselves as actually being very generous. They're taking from the state and they're providing to their own networks. But what that kind of system has created is two classes in the country. There is one class that is the political elite and everyone who is connected to them through family relationships, through local political relationships, economic relationships, who benefit hugely from that distribution of wealth. And the politicians feel like they're doing a great service by distributing wealth along these networks. They get a lot of positive feedback from that, and it's a kind of self-reinforcing bubble of wealth sharing, of network building, of relationship building that also translates into political campaigning and into the delivery of power at election time. And then you have the class of Iraqis who are completely excluded, so who don't have an in to any of these elite political structures, so who aren't benefiting from all of this informal wealth that is being shared, and then who suffer the consequences of this broken state because the resources of the state are not being channeled in a professional way through to these kind of dispassionate bureaucratic services that serve all citizens equally. And so they're the ones who are really losing out. But there's the way in which that system has been built and the problem of that system, the reason why it's so corrosive and why it's fundamentally undermining the stability of the country, that's not well understood by the political elite. And so because they haven't really identified what the problem is, and they have not recognized their complicity in the problem, so they're very, very far from thinking through solutions that could really have an impact. And so when you get, you have this backdrop of kind of chaos in the south, and yet when you sit with Iraqi political leaders and talk about government formation, it's as if it's not happening. It's just, it's still back to, well, who has how many seats that they can properly control. And Mike is absolutely right about this. You have to look at who is really able to control their seats and maintain them. So, which means that Barzani is very powerful. It means Abadi really is not very powerful. And I think Abadi has been further undermined to the extent that it matters, has been further undermined by these protests, given how he has tried in the last few years to present himself as a reformer, to present himself as somebody who is a champion for good governance. I think having these protests on his watch further undermines him, but he already had a very weak negotiating position, and the weakness of that negotiating position, I think, is more important ultimately when it comes to these machinations behind the scenes over government formation, unfortunately, than what's happening in the rest of the country. One thing I would say, though, is that there is a new fear, and to some extent this fear has been present, but I think it's come to the fore, that excluding Sadrists from any new government would be very dangerous. I think there's a sense that the Sadrists have not really participated in these protests. Sadr has tried a bit of a one foot in, one foot out approach because he's very invested in pursuing political power, and he wants to have a very prominent role in the next Iraqi government, and that is limiting him from participating in the protest, and then that therefore is limiting the power of the protest, because the Sadrists previously have given the protest movement a lot of organizational coherence. They've given it numbers, just the scale that Sadr is able to mobilize. I think his participation in the protest would transform the level of threat that the protests would be seen as posing against the Iraqi state. So I think there's a new recognition amongst a number of actors, Iraqi political actors, but also foreign actors who are active in the country, that Sadrists inside is probably necessary in order to prevent a movement like this from exploding further.
Genevieve, you have a follow-up?
No, I just wanted to add something briefly since we're sitting in Washington. I mean, the other issue that's undermining Prime Minister Abadi is that apparently, at least from the people I met, the U.S. Embassy has made it very clear that he's their choice for the Prime Minister and that he should have a third term. And this is further, undermining his credibility in addition to the other issues that Nusayba mentioned.
I see. I heard Nusayba say that Iraq is full of Robin Hoods, Mike, but in a recent piece, right after the election, actually, you wrote that there are two scenarios for forming the Iraqi government, and this question is for you, Mike. One scenario would be a majority diversity government. Another would be what we've had since 2003, a chaotic unity government. Given the recent events and given your recent interviews, are those still the two scenarios? And if so, which one is more likely? Or is there a third one?
No, I think they're still the likely ones, and it's only because they're so obvious. It doesn't take much brains to put those two together. The unity government is always the most likely in Iraq because with everybody in, what I've always called the government of everyone and no one. Everyone's in it. No one agrees what it's supposed to do, and does not have a manifesto, and it can dissolve at any moment. In Iraq. You basically have an election every day. Every time the parliament sits, in theory, you could have a vote of no confidence against the prime minister. I mean, there is no permanent government in Iraq. it has to earn its the cabinet and the prime minister has to earn its continuing survival really on a weekly basis. So I think the unity government tends to become the model, because once you have let some people into your government, you're then faced with the alarming possibility of telling some people they are to be excluded from the government. And we already saw in the first week after the election the discomfort with that idea, that there might be an opposition bloc that was fully excluded from government, that got nothing. And perhaps that opposition bloc could include factions that had significant armed militias or had significant backing from foreign powers. Or it could splinter the Shia collective unity. It just didn't seem like a very, the proper thing to do. And you could see the system starting to react against it. So it's always going to be a blobby unity government, I think, at this point. The question is this: how is it tiered? Who's at the centre, who's in the middle, and who's at the edges? Who gets the good stuff? Who's really in a commanding position to keep this thing together when there's a threat of a no confidence vote, etc., etc.? So, I mean, it's still a blobby unity government, which, as I think, has got Sairun and Hikmah at the centre. These seem to me to have the cohesion, the relationship with each other, the success in the elections. I think the KDP will be in there in the mix, and it will draw some Kurds in with it potentially. I think that Badr within the Fatah coalition is definitely there. I think that Saib al-Haq might be slightly outside the inner circle. I think, Wataniya with Alawi will be on the edges of it. I think that some other Sunni and small Kurdish groups will be at the edges of that circle. And the PUK, I think, is sitting, on the edges of that circle, because I think if it probably came out worse from these elections than anybody. I mean, Iraqis don't like weakness, they don't like division, they don't like people who get caught cheating, and in the PUK, I think it's pretty clear to see, there was some pretty bad conduct in this election, and they got caught more than anyone else, I think. And the important thing is this recount that's going on right now is purely cosmetic. It's just there to offer everybody the minimum amount of accountability for what just happened in this election. Almost, I think it's fair to say, the vast majority of the distortion in this election cannot be caught with the recount. It's voter suppression, it's voter intimidation, and you're not going to catch that. But in parallel with the recount, I would look out for something a little deeper going on within the Iraqi system, e.g. an intelligence investigation into what's happening now. A little bit like the way an investigation might not reverse the result of a controversial election, but may well result in some significant effects down the line. And so, as we get closer to government formation, or even during the next 4 years, we may find some echoes coming up again of this election, and certain movements, possibly at Saib al-Haq, coming in for a bit more criticism in that medium term.
Talking about Saib al-Haq, maybe we should shift gears a little bit to go down to something that you all mentioned in your answer to my initial question, Iran and Iran's influence in all of this. So, Mike, let me get back to you. You ended your answer by talking about Asaib. So what is Iran up to these days? What is Iran's answer to not only government formation, but these protests, some of which have been targeted at not only Iran as a country, but some of Iran's key symbols? So what does that mean for the sort of way ahead between now and government formation in Iraq? Mike, back to you.
I'll just go quick, because I know that both my co-panelists have been looking at this in some detail. I think in this set of elections, talking to all the key leaders in Baghdad, sometimes they throw a lot of Iran at you because they figure you're an American. That's what you're gonna want to hear, right? But I've tended to get through that level with them, so they don't bother so much. They're not as focused on Iran in this election. They know the reason these elections went wrong was Iraq, right? Nothing else. And they want, if you look at the centerpiece of Sairun's platform, their kind of manifesto they're trying to push for, within a kind of an institutionalized majority government, where you kind of, you take a bunch of parties and you turn them into a actual formal coalition, ruling coalition, that has an institution behind it. It's sort of, you make a party post-election, essentially, instead of just something that's temporary and can fall apart at any minute. But what they're trying to put at the centre of that, if you look at 3 of their 5 points, the 3 central points are all about rebalancing relations between Iraq and regional states and international states. They're all about, nominally it's, not presence of foreign forces is too explosive for Iraq right now, permanent presence of foreign forces. So let's institutionalise that, limit it, define it, etc. But a lot of it's to do with, it's coded language for, we need to distance somewhat from Iran. We need to reduce the amount of Iranian influence in the system. They're doing that on their own. We're not telling them to do that. The US hasn't got that influence now, and it wouldn't be effective if it tried to use it to force the parties to talk in that way. They came up with this themselves. So they understand that it's this imbalance between them and Iran is a problem. From my perspective looking at it, I think Iran's taking a much more serious interest in the Kurdistan region now since the referendum. I think they'll have recognised that, they had a bit of a blind spot. They put more effort into federal Iraq than they did into Kurdistan, and that kind of bit them. And I suspect they're going to be putting much more attention up north and bringing more pressure and building more networks there than they have in the past. And, and they've got fertile ground to build on because, they've got a bunch of people up there who feel pretty annoyed at the US right now, right up to the top level, very, very annoyed. So, I think they're going to build out in Kurdistan a bit. I think the sanctions is going to become a much more interesting hot issue. When JCPOA went down with Iran, the sanctions, were announced that they would be kicking back in August and November. Iraqis, their message boards lit up straight away. What does this mean for us? What does this mean for us? They could tell straight away that it was going to have potentially significant impact. I think what's really interesting here is there's an opportunity as well as a risk for Iraq. When you speak to senior Iraqi politicians, their first thought is, we need to be like Jordan in the 90s under Iraq sanctions. We need to be like get a pass from the US, because we have these interactions with Iran like electricity that can't be interrupted. And then their second thought is, but there are some Iranian imports that we don't want to see, and this could be good for us in this way and that way. Their thought immediately turns opportunistically to what Iraq might be able to gain from this, whether it's, essentially soaking up some of Iran's OPEC quota, whether it is keeping some kinds of imports out that suppress Iraq's economy. So I think there's, if the US wanted to box clever, it could maybe tailor its sanctions on Iran as they refer to Iraq in such ways as help Iraq rather than hurt Iraq.
Nusayba, you also looked in this issue of Iranian influence, and Mike mentioned that they're probably looking up north, which has generally been a safer, better, more hospitable environment for U.S. influence. How are the Iranians doubling down on their influence in Kurdistan? What does that mean for the KRG elections that are scheduled for end of September, if they take place?
Yeah, so it's actually been really interesting talking to senior officials from the KDP and the PUK and Goran in the Kurdistan region and seeing how much Iran is coming up in the conversation about government formation as compared with how much it comes up in Baghdad, which you'd expect it to be a bigger issue when you're talking to Badr and Sa'irun and Nasser. But Iran has really made a massive effort in the Kurdistan region since the failure of the referendum to achieve its goals. Iran has really taken the opportunity, somewhat like the Russians, although obviously with very different ends in mind, but at a time of great vulnerability for the Kurdistan region, Iran has showed up and has made a very compelling case for why an alliance with Iran will benefit the Kurdistan regional government and will guarantee benefits for the KRG that the alliance with the United States failed to provide. And so what the Iranians have been saying is, if you want to have a deal with Baghdad that lasts, you want a decent chunk of the Iraqi budget. You want to maintain a decent amount of autonomy. We can deliver that. And the best actors to work with in Baghdad for delivering that deal are the harder line actors who we're very close to. So we would recommend that you start building relationships with Badr, that you engage with Maliki and state of law, and that you start to see Fatah and state of law as natural allies, because any promises that they make to you as part of this government formation process, we will underwrite, we can guarantee that they will be delivered. And good luck to you making a deal with Abadi and Sa'irun, because what promises has Abadi ever delivered on? And who the hell backs what he says? Because it's not the US and it isn't us. So and let alone, I mean, Sa'irun can't keep a promise with itself. You know, it's a very chaotically run organization. You know, Sadr every so often just fires his entire political leadership. It holds his own government hostage. You can see why Abadi has been reluctant to join a government with the Sadrists, because he knows that no matter what kind of a deal he concludes with the Sadrists, that there's always going to be the guillotine raised above his head. And the minute Sadr decides it's politically expedient for him to go from partner to revolutionary, he will make that switch. And so Iran has a compelling case to make. They're saying, you want a decent deal that is going to be respected, unlike every deal that's been made to you in every previous election, then we are the people to go through to make that happen. And I think my understanding is that really the KDP and the PUK are pretty convinced by this and are feeling pretty confident. I was expecting, when I went to Erbil and Sulaymaniyah recently, I was expecting there to be some nervousness. You know, well, what does it mean? You know, what kind of leverage does the KRG really have in this government formation process? If there is another grand Shia coalition, as it looked like was happening, you know, when you had Sa'irun and Hikmah then joining Fatah, then Nasser coming in the early days. I mean, that's broken down now. But at the time, I was like, are you not worried that there's a grand Shia coalition coming together? Suddenly you don't have a side to pick, so you're not a kingmaker. What leverage do you have now? How do you get concessions out of Baghdad in an environment like this? And what I found was some very, very relaxed Kurds who gave the very distinct impression that the deal has already been made and it's a deal they're very comfortable with and it's a deal that they believe is going to be respected. And it's not really about specifically how the cards fall here, as long as there is some decent PUK and KDP support for Fatah and a good chunk of state of law to be in government, then I think they believe that the Iranians are going to ensure some respect from Baghdad for a normalized, healthy relationship that the KRG can live with. Obviously, within the bounds of the Iraqi constitution, that point has been made very clear. But also, it's interesting to see the KDP embrace the presidency position and really go for, really stake a claim to the position and start to look at different candidates. And there are some decent candidates. And I think for Baghdad, it's kind of a victory. You know, to have the KDP come back to Baghdad in this very senior position, it's in a way, the Iraqis can see it, can sell it as the ultimate defeat. It's the full re-engagement of the Kurds in the political process in Baghdad. And so I think it's worked out well for all involved and much faster than any of us had expected.
Fascinating. Genevieve, you lived in Iran, you know the Iranian DNA. Specifically, just to follow up on Mike and Nusayba's, what kind of overtures is Iran making to the Sunni community, since it doesn't really trust the Shia government of Baghdad of being inclusive of the Sunnis in a way that won't result in another ISIS. Are they making overtures to the Sunni community directly? One, and then maybe just a broader question. What do you think Iran will be doing in the next 4 years in Iraq? What are their goals, given not only JCPOA, a more aggressive U.S. policy, but also their other activities in the region, including Yemen and Syria? Briefly.
I think if you look at this from the perspective of Tehran, just touching on a lot of the points that my two colleagues have made, if I'm the Iranians, I'm sort of panicking now, right? Because there are U.S. sanctions coming. There's also, let's not forget, they have their own civil unrest at home, which is quite serious. There have been widespread protests in Iran since December all over the country over similar issues, over water issues, over lack of jobs, over lack of services that are being provided by the government in various parts of Iran. So, and you have sort of a government somewhat in disarray, certainly not to the degree in Iraq, but you have a president who has considerably lost his power, a foreign minister who's also lost his power because the United States withdrew from the nuclear deal. You have no really limited possibilities now to sell oil on the world market. The Europeans are running the other way, so much so that the Europeans this week asked India to continue buying oil from Iran. So from the Iranian perspective, Iraq is really their only hope, I think, or their primary hope of surviving sanctions, and also dealing with their own economic crisis. And in addition to that, I think from a political point of view, and I would disagree with Nusayba on slightly the point that I think that the Iranian motivation with the Kurds is not so much so that it's an opportunity to sort of, get back at the United States, as much as it is really an opportunity to control the government formation and the new government in Baghdad. It's a weapon. Of course there are economic benefits, but I think that it's more of a weapon to make deals with, the government formation that's underway now. And, if we step back a minute before the election sort of coalition became clear, what was very interesting for me as I began watching this way back in the winter was the lack of this Shia bloc, because the Shia were quite divided, and they, of course, still are now. So that, to me, was definitely of great concern to the Iranians, because without a really unified, solidified Shia bloc in Iraq, they sort of have problems, which is what they're dealing with now. They're trying to figure out, how can they form or be influential in forming a coalition that is going to form the next government, that is strong enough, as Mike said, to have enough seats to help, form the next government, to help, to influence who's the next prime minister is going to be, which the Iranians are very concerned about. And we really haven't touched on this, but the Iranians want to make sure that the prime minister, of course, favors their interests. And they also want to make sure, of course, that there are ministries that their loyalists control. For example, the transportation ministry and the other ministries that are going to enable them to use the Iraqi economy in order to address all the limitations that they're facing regarding sanctions. So I think that from the Iranian perspective, there's a lot of concern, there's panic, not only because of, the confusion in Iraq and the formation of the government and U.S. sanctions, but also what they're facing at home domestically.
Thank you, Mike. I'd like to ask you a question about the lingering ISIS insurgency and what are some of the driving forces in that escalating perhaps into more instability in Iraq. So how dangerous is it, and how capable are the Iraqi security forces in dealing with it, and what kind of help do they need from the United States?
So there's there's a lot of flashbacks happening right now. What's happening right now isn't exactly the same as the past. It's not as dangerous as what was happening in 2011 through to 2014. But there's opportunities being missed here. I think that's the best way of putting it in this counterinsurgency. And what I mean is this. Iraq rebuilt sufficient military strength with the coalition support to recapture 24 cities and towns, and that was a fantastic achievement. But that doesn't mean it automatically had a ready-to-go counterinsurgency and counter-terrorism capability that could move to the next phase of the war against ISIS. ISIS moved to the next phase of the war against Iraq instantly, and it did it over 36 months ago in Diyala province. It did it probably 24 months ago in Salahuddin, and it's been fighting the next war for a number of years already in a number of places. And it will be, doing so in Mosul eventually, and it will be doing so in the remaining places that got liberated. So they transitioned into insurgency without skipping a beat, really. And the Iraqi security forces can't adapt that quickly. They need to retool, retrain, and redeploy to be able to fight this different kind of slow war now. When ISIS is in a city, you can concentrate significant amount of your available strength on one target and destroy that target. Now they're dispersed, they're everywhere. It's much harder. So that's one factor. We shouldn't expect Iraq to be able to adapt immediately to this. They're overstretched. If you look at the area outside of Kirkuk city, the rural farm belts out there, Hawija, Rashad, Riyadh, etc., there are 8 federal police brigades out there right now and a number of other units. That's massive concentration in quite a small 75 km by 75 km area. There's 10 battalions have been sent down to Basra, and a significant proportion of that will probably have to stay down there. We have one of Iraq's best units, the 3rd CTS in Kirkuk, tied down on important policing activities there. And this overstretch can't last for long. They simply don't have the forces are not big enough, and they haven't been, weight's not being taken off of them by the generation of local police forces fast enough. And this has a number of implications. But just to finish on the threat level, there's 2 Iraqs. There's Iraq at night and there's Iraq during the day. Iraq during the day, ISIS is on its back foot. Iraq at night in a rural area, those people don't feel liberated. In the next 6 months, 100 villages will have their muqtars assassinated. That's based on the kind of metrics we're seeing every week now. 100 villages in northern Iraq will have the most important person in their village killed in the next 6 months. That's how it's been in the last, 3 months. You could say 50 or so has been happening. When this goes on for 2 or 3 years, you can imagine what kind of effect it has. You have to have a very high level of control to be able to stop that stuff from happening. When you talk to intelligence people inside Iraq, Iraqi coalition, they will use alarming phrases like ISIS has complete freedom of maneuver at night in key areas. That's not victory. So what we're looking at right now is that my metrics analysis, which I released in CTC Sentinel, and it's, I think, still very relevant, worth taking a look at, I'm going to do an update at some point, is suggests that ISIS rebooted to about early 2013 levels after most areas are liberated. But in 2013, they were on the upswing. This is 2013 on a shallow downswing, hopefully, or at least holding in the middle. If Iraq does not continue to develop its security forces, falls into bad counterinsurgency habits, doesn't allow Sunnis to repopulate areas, where they're IDPs and they've not been allowed back in, doesn't rebuild towns, all the usual stuff, doesn't develop a targeted counter-terrorism capability, very important, intelligence-led raiding. If it doesn't do all of those things, we're going to see, as we did in early 2011, the needle just start to pick up again, and then it's going to get higher and higher. Now, I don't think it's going to result in, one day a Mosul falling again, because that was very peculiar and particular circumstances and a lot of luck that led to that happening. But it is going to result in Iraq getting held on what I used to call back in 2011 the plateau. And I can't believe I'm saying it again. But basically this plateau that you can't get off of, where the whole centre of the country is what, not centre, but the centre north, Baghdad north, Baghdad west, Kirkuk, Nineveh, is broken glass. It's just a big pile of broken glass that you can't do anything in. You can't rebuild it. You can't get investment into it. You can't operate strategic infrastructures through it. You can't get people to move back there permanently. Kurdistan is intact. Southern Iraq and Baghdad are intact. But this middle bit doesn't get fixed. So, you know, that's what we're looking at right now. The ISF and the PMF and the Kurds did a fantastic job in kicking ISIS out of the cities. But this next part requires a different setup. And I think coalition support could be a very big part of that. We have a lot to add to that part in terms of intelligence, in terms of providing overwatch, air power, not bomb dropping air power really so much, even though a lot of that's still going on. But, you know, ISR drones, signal intelligence, all the rest of it. But, you know, Iraq's, what they're doing right now, they're pretending that they're doing counterinsurgency. But it's not. What they're really doing is sweeping operations where you have, you know, 2,000 guys chasing 2 guys on a motorbike, you know, through the Hawija farming areas with billions of little canals, and you can't really find anyone or stop anyone.
So I have 6 minutes left before I get to your questions. But I started asking you all one question, so I'd like to conclude with asking you all one question, and that's about U.S. policy. What we have seen is a renewed re-engagement with the Arab countries, with the Gulf countries on one hand, a more aggressive stature toward Iran on the other. And yet, the Iraq fatigue, I think, seems to somehow linger in policy circles in this town, on one hand. And yet, you presented, you know, a myriad of opportunities and risks of you know, business as usual might present. And one thing that we haven't seen much of a review is a new Iraq policy. It seems that the key players and policymakers from Washington's end seem to be the same. The policy itself seems to be the continuation of the previous administration. So my question to you is, does Washington need to review its Iraq policy? And if so, what would be your top piece of advice to the new administration? And each of you will get 2 minutes to answer this question. I'll start with Genevieve.
That's a tough question. I guess I would say that one of the issues that some of the top officials that I met with that one priority, I think, for them was, as they see ISIS sort of reconstituting itself, and as Mike said, in different ways, but nonetheless they are reconstituting itself in Iraq, they fear that they're not going to get the same kind of support fighting ISIS from the United States and the training that went on for the Iraqi army that they got in the past. So that's one of their fears, that they fear that in the Trump administration's, you know, clear message that from their understanding, Iraq is not a priority. As you said, there's no Iraq policy. Iraq is not a priority. And that's something that is well understood in Baghdad. So I would say that some sort of gesture toward the, you know, reconstitution of ISIS would be on top of the list. The other top of the list, I think, would be, as Mike said, dealing, you know, creating caveats with the U.S. sanctions, because there is an opportunity to sort of extend aid to the Iraqis in ways that they're going to be hurt by U.S. sanctions because of Iran. And so I think that that's definitely a priority, because I think from the Iraqi perspective, they sort of feel that they're losing on all ends. Okay, so they're losing to some degree because Iran once again is making now an official footprint in the government. In the past, it was more unofficial. I would say now it's an official footprint in the new government formation. But at the same time, they're losing out because, you know, Iran is now can't even supply the kinds of services that they did in the past that benefited the Iraqis because of sanctions.
I see.
So I would say that those are some of the priorities that were mentioned to me.
Thank you, Genevieve. Nusayba?
So I think the US needs to show up in Iraq in a much more substantial way. I think they should engage with everyone, and they should engage on the basis of priority issues and not on the basis of personalities. And I think the number one thing is this obsession with Abadi must be prime minister again, I think is really just a reflection of laziness in policymaking here, that instead of engaging with the breadth of real challenges that need to be tackled in Iraq through sustained, difficult, deep-seated engagement, instead of doing that, you just pick a guy and decide that he's the Messiah and that he can save everything despite plenty of evidence to the contrary. And so I think what they need to do is engage across the political spectrum, which frankly is just the sensible thing to do because Abadi is unlikely to maintain his position. And you need relationships across the board that, you know, our strategic interests in Iraq don't just end if Abadi doesn't maintain his position. And what there needs to be is just some coherence in terms of the communication across the board with all of the political actors. What we care about is security cooperation. We care about political reform that addresses the drivers of radicalization in the country. And we care about service delivery. Those are issues on which Sairun is having conversations. Those are issues that Badr is having conversations about. You need to have broad engagement, and you need to look for opportunities to influence and look for opportunities to cooperate across the spectrum. But in order to do that, you need some real engagement in DC, some real pressure on the embassy, and frankly, just, you know, to be interested in doing a better job of policy on this area.
Thanks, Nasiba. Mike, you get the last word.
Great, and you know, thank everyone for coming today. There's actually an entirely different panel which I would love to sit down and have them come up with Ahmed Ali, with Doug Ollivant, and with Ken Pollock. You know, who would all give, like, you know, at least as good, if not better than my own stuff today anyway. But I think on US policy, what we need to do, we need to help Iraq to create a clean, strong state. Iran ultimately wants a dirty, weak state in Iraq, and the US should patiently work with Iraqis to make a clean, strong state. We can do things that we haven't really tried to do in the past. For instance, we can find where the money is, and we can tell the Iraqi intelligence services where it is, and we can point them at the right bank accounts. We can tell them where the dirty politicians have the money.
Okay.
And we could do that in a targeted way. Financial intelligence. We can help them with e-government. We can help them develop out their judges, the protection of judges, the training of specialist judges, of auditors. We can help them reform their banking sector. We can basically plug into something Iraqis want a lot, which is anti-corruption. It's a dangerous game to be in Iraq.
Yeah.
But if we did it subtly enough, we could maybe be involved in that process. We could help with biometrics of security forces, including, of course, PMF. So intelligence support, anti-corruption support, I think are really important. Helping governors' offices to spend their budgets. You know, you can't give Basra $1 billion. They'll have to give it back at the end of the year. The bits that wasn't stolen. So, you know, these people need help. Mosul Dam was a great example of the US helping Iraq. The US and Italy and other players helping Iraq, doing something really vital that could have saved the lives of hundreds of thousands of people potentially. That was a great example. So, you know, I think there's something to be done on that front. It's counterintelligence and counter-terrorism and intelligence work, military development, all very important. They're the things I usually talk about. But I actually think what the US should do is help Iraq to fight corruption.
Thank you very much. It's time for your questions, but before we do that, please join me in giving them a very warm round of applause. All right. So we have mics in the room. Please raise your hand and identify yourself, and please ask a question. Ambassador Leaf.
Well, I have a million questions, but I'll take one.
Thank you.
Thanks. Nusebi, I'm really curious, this issue about the speed and sort of seamlessness with which and effectiveness with which Iran pivoted to the Kurds and the Kurds responded. Because as I recall, Tehran was the ultimate heavy last September in crushing every last hope that fear and intimidation vis-a-vis the Kurds, that if they went so far as to really try to bolt for the exit, they would. Iran would make sure that they paid. Now, they went ahead with the referendum, but Iran really played a heavy. So why have the Kurds pivoted themselves?
Yeah, so I think it's a question of who is in control and who matters. And I think the Kurds, for such a long time, is really since Halabja, have invested heavily in exercising influence in the West, in deciding that what matters is the United States, what matters is European capitals, and if you exercise influence effectively in these parts of the world, you can translate that into support for your policy agenda back home. And the referendum upended that, because after years and years, decades of investment on this narrative, on making the case for independence, the moral case for independence, the financial case for independence, putting kind of maximal effort into the diplomatic work behind a move like this, to see the US and European capitals equivocate for a long time, have a ton of mixed messages going in from different parts of different governments, and ultimately for them to back away and support actually the Iraqi government in the retaking of the disputed areas and the condemnation of the referendum. It was seen as not only a betrayal and a sense that the Western world cannot be relied on, it was also this kind of devastating sense of failure of all of these years of investment, but also it raised the question of how much the West cares about this region in general, how invested it is, and whether the route to influence really does lie through these capitals. And I think Tehran made a very convincing case. They said, we told you this was a red line. We enforced the red line. What we threatened to do if you took this step, we then did. And so if you want to engage with a power that keeps its word, that has straightforward messaging around what it will and won't do, what it will and won't tolerate, then you need to deal with us. And so I think it's an interesting dichotomy, because really it makes sense. On the one hand, they very clearly engaged in the kind of crackdown that they said they would engage in, but it demonstrated that they follow through. And so when they flip over and say, look, within the bounds of what we're prepared to accept, we will get you the best deal. And this is a transaction. You're going to need to support the people we care about in Baghdad. But there's a belief and a trust that the Iranians will follow through. Whereas here, it's chaos. And if you're going to give up an opportunity to actually claw back some of what you've lost because this place is telling you not to engage with Iran. Calculations have changed.
Mike?
Yeah. So I was struck in Baghdad. Sorry, I won't hold this up long, but I was struck in Baghdad by the way what happened last September and October had in some ways made the Kurds more palatable partners now. Often when you're at your weakest, you become more attractive as a partner. And, in this case, the Kurds, they don't have that fear factor down in Baghdad that they had a year ago. They're seen to have stumbled. They're seen to have been isolated. And as a result, it's quite easy for Baghdad to imagine partnering with them, being generous with them, working with them in a longer-term negotiation. What they'll say is, don't come to Baghdad like you used to in government formation with a set of preconditions. Come and stay. Come to Baghdad and stay and keep talking, because even if we wanted to talk to you about a revenue-sharing deal right now, that conversation's got to involve Basra when it happens next year. It's got to be the revenue-sharing deal for everywhere, not just for the Kurdistan region. So I think, the Kurds actually have quite a lot of opportunities right now. Turkey, Russia, and Iran. The question about how the Iranians acted. It's a good friend of mine once told me it's called break and mend. You demonstrate power over someone in the Middle East, and then you extend a hand. And I think there's been a lot of that recently. But with Baghdad, I think the Kurds have an enormous opportunity now if they want to play, for 4 years, every single day doing this stuff down in Baghdad. And with the US, just imagine an alternative reality in which Kurdistan held its independence referendum this September. All right? In the middle of all this chaos in Baghdad, with the way the US government has swung with Iran, with the interest in religious minorities in northern Iraq, with the way the State Department's trending towards a hawkish end of the spectrum, where NSC is right now. I don't think it means you go for the referendum again, but what I think it means you do is, now at the time in which some Kurds are most angry against the US, there might actually be the best opportunities to re-engage with the US. But just think about this for a second. Right now, they're selling all their own oil, as in within the Kurdistan region, its own operated crude. They're managing their own revenues. They're keeping their non-oil revenues. They have visa on arrival at their airports. And they're receiving US military equipment and payment of the Peshmerga. That's pretty good, right, compared to where we thought it would be in October. And it could get better.
Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council. Thank you all. It's really good to catch up on all of this. I have a couple questions. One, who are the likely prospects for Prime Minister if it's not Abadi? And the other is, in terms of sanctions busting, Iraq went through a terrible experience with sanctions, obviously, under the Saddam period. I would imagine that there's some sympathy for what's about to hit Iran. How do you think it's going to work? I mean, my understanding is that the Iranians can do things like export electricity. That's not banned. Do you think they're going to try to mix their oil with Kurdish oil, with Iraqi oil? Is that feasible? So just some sense of how Iran might try to use Iraq to get around sanctions. Thank you.
Who would like to tackle that? Sure, Judy.
I think on the issue of the Prime Minister, there's a disagreement within the leaders of Fatah. Whether it should be Hadi Amri or not. I would assume that could be an Iranian choice for PM. And I think that the issue is quite complicated, particularly as it sort of affects the U.S. So what I was told also, not only from Iraqi sources, but from Iranian sources, is that there's also a disagreement in Tehran over whether it's to their benefit to have someone who can sort of be the liaison with the Americans, especially now that sanctions are coming, or whether they want to take a very absolutist approach and have someone like Hadi Amri, who's, not welcome as the prime minister by the United States. So I think that that's the first issue, and that's something that's being debated among the Shia factions in Iraq. No. I mean, there, people also. It was sort of interesting, maybe because I'm American, that people wouldn't give specific names as to who they thought could be other alternatives. But I think there's a lot of feeling that it could be a dark horse. I mean, Abadi was somewhat of a dark horse in the beginning. So I think the possibilities are open, and I think that's part of the reason that that the formation is going to be a long process. And so, that's a big issue, and that's something, of course, that the Iranians are very focused on now, that because who the prime minister is will control also their power over the ministries. So, and that's very important to them, especially as sanctions are coming. But I think that, another issue that we really haven't discussed, which is important for the Iranians, is that they buy dollars on auction in Iraq. And so they want to make sure that as their hard currency is being depleted significantly because of their inability to sell oil, their inability to sell, as you know, their inability to sell oil began a long time ago because of the anticipation of sanctions even. So even deals that they had with European companies, were dissolved because they don't want to be penalized by sanctions. So the Iranians particularly want to be able to have access to dollars through the Iraqi markets. And so these are some of the issues that I think that the Iranians are focused on at this point, ahead of sanctions.
Mike, to her second question, how possible is it to see a reverse scenario of when Iran used to help Iraq bust oil sanctions? Can Iraq return the favor?
Yeah, maybe. And, I think that the payment of electricity is a problematic issue because, some of that stuff might have been being used as cover for threat finance in the recent past. We could well see swaps introduced as a way for Iran to pay for electricity, which, the debt accrues at about $100 million a month. We did a piece on that a while back, a few months ago, based on some information coming out of Iraq. So, the electricity is an interesting one because, it's clearly something that the US doesn't want 100 million going missing in Beirut or, eventually Syria each month. But the Iraqis don't want to lose, 1.4 gigawatts of power either. So, that's going to be a tricky one. If you don't mind, on the Premiership, can I just say something? Sure. So, I think, what's funny is, you speak to these guys in Baghdad about who's the next Prime Minister. They kind of throw up some names. They're usually kind of unimaginative names. They're as unimaginative as everyone is on our side of the ocean. Sometimes they pick other names and they introduce you to other people, and you look at this person and you're like, wow, you're just Hyder al-Abadi, but not in Dower. You're just the same kind of guy. You even kind of look the same a bit. And so, it's not like there's only one guy in Iraq who can be a friendly, Western-leaning, good communicating, former professional guy. But, when you look at this person, who is it? Let's be honest, it's probably a man. He's Shia. He's a Shia guy. He comes from a professional background. He's kind of respectable. He's probably in his 50s or 60s. He can't be a nobody, as they put it. He has to be associated with a political party and have that kind of oomph. But nobody wants to buy the premiership with 15 points, so he has to be able to distance himself from his party and freeze his membership of it, or somehow, promise to not benefit his party. Every time you do this exercise, you draw up a list and you're like, the first name's Hyder al-Abadi, every single time. And that's the problem, is that everybody's list begins with Hyder al-Abadi. And, what I found most amusing being there is, I'm just still not sure he wants it. There's all these things that you would do to just make it a lock, and he could have had it in the first couple of weeks, and he just won't do them. And he, I'm just not sure. Think about this. If you had 4 years to be Iraqi Prime Minister, and in that 4 years, you went from having 25 cities controlled by ISIS to 0, you re-won all of their oil fields, all of the cities that were lost. You brought 3 million people back. You survived an economic crash where the price of oil halved. You got an IMF deal. I would cut and run at that point.
What are the things he could have done that would have made it a lock?
Oh, I think very early in this process, there was a moment where Cyroon and Hikmah said, "Ooh, we did well, and he didn't do so good, but he's still there. And, as long as he acts the right way right now and accepts the right conditions, let's just lock this up now, right now." And he hesitated, as he often does, and Fatah jumped in instead. And that's when they started then to look at that kind of broader, big blobby, Shia alliance again for.
Can we ask Barbara, because we have an Iran expert here, what you think about your own question about how is Iran thinking about using?
This is a little unorthodox.
Yeah, interesting to see what.
I haven't looked at this particular aspect in detail, but I'm sure that Iran is looking for a return on its investment in Iraq over the years, and that there are many people who are already considering this issue. I didn't know about the auction of dollars. I think that's fascinating, but I would expect a lot of oil to get mingled so that we're not entirely sure of its origin, that Iran will will get a discount of some sort or some other remuneration in return for this. We had an event at the Atlantic Council last week on oil sanctions. People thought that this kind of activity might reach about 100,000, 150,000 barrels of oil a day, which is not a lot, but if you're losing half your exports, which is entirely possible that this could happen again, it's not nothing. And of course, they'll be doing similar things with their other neighbors, not just with Iraq. To maximize. And, you know, the electricity, I mean, they ran out of electricity in Iran, which was why this all happened. They've had terrible blackouts, but that will ease as the summer heat passes, and I think that's important for them. In terms of the other kinds of goods, agricultural goods and so on that they supply, I mean, those aren't going to be sanctioned as far as I know, so I would think all the regular commerce would continue, and the new closeness with the Kurds will be very important. I mean, traditionally they had a good relationship with the PUK, and Kurds are going to be more dependent on them, so I would look for a lot of smuggling to go through Kurdistan.
Genevieve?
I just wanted to raise the question. I don't know that we can say definitively that the reason they cut off the electricity in Iraq is because of electricity shortages in Iran. I think that there could be other reasons. I mean, or let me put it this way. It's a win-win. They create chaos in Iraq, and they sort of try to help themselves at home. But also, you know, why is there an electricity shortage in Iran? I mean, you know, so, I mean, that's also a sort of, not to sort of advance Arab conspiracy theories, but I mean, you know, I also raised that question. Why is there even an electricity shortage in Iran? So I'm not sure that that's the only motivation.
Gentleman in the second row.
Walt Cutler, former Foreign Service, U.S. Foreign Service. Very little has been said about Iraq's relations with the Gulf states, and I infer from that it really doesn't amount to much importance in Iraq. But would you have anything to say at all about those relations, particularly with Saudi Arabia? Is it just a modus vivendi?
And that's an excellent question, and I would add to it whether the electricity shortages in Iraq might create an opportunity for the Saudi Arabia or the Kuwaitis in particular to be filling in those gaps. Who would like to take a jab at that? Mike?
I'll take a first go. Yeah, and you know, the Kuwaitis just provided 17 generators and 18,000 tons of gas oil into Basra. So, you know, they're quick to step into and do a goodwill gesture in that way. The one thing I really heard about this, you know, I was hoping there'd be more on this trip. I tend to ask everyone a set of standard questions amidst all the others, try and get as many answers on that one question as possible, right? Almost like a mini survey. I asked everyone about KSA and hardly got any reaction. And you know, and it's a shame, I mean, except for one Sunni politician who, I wish I could swear right now, but he said, I don't need a bleeping stadium, right? Because they offered to build the huge stadium in Baghdad, and, you know, he's like, I don't need a stadium, you know, it's the last thing I need. But that just, so he was just annoyed. But most of them, the only thing I did get from it was a kind of this concern. They felt the US was trying to sort of subcontract Iraq to KSA, like, hold this for a while, I'll be back, you know, and the Sunni politicians were like particularly concerned about this idea that they might be hoisted onto the Saudis instead of the Americans and kind of left in their tender, you know, kind of grip. So there's not enough happening yet, but you know, wait and see.
I can add a little bit. So it's been. But over the last year, maybe a bit more, various Gulf states have tried to work behind the scenes to create a grand Sunni coalition along the lines of Iraqia that we saw in 2010. And of course, the Gulf being the Gulf, destroyed their own process with the Qatar-Saudi rift. And then they started undermining the leaders they had been grooming by accusing them of being pro-Castro or pro-Saudi, and just so they're not very good at this. You know, there might be, maybe, yes, there's been some nice public outreach, some PR, whatever. I think really it's fluff because they're not doing the groundwork of building. They're not present. They're not building real relationships. They're not building up leverage that they can use when it comes to moments like this, formative moments where a new government's being put together. They don't have things to throw around to get a government together that's along the lines of what they want to see, that serves their strategic interests. So a bit of a blumbling effort on their part that's not really produced very much so far. But still nice words, you know, diplomatic outreach. It's positive. It's better than it was before. But it hasn't translated into something substantive yet.
And no bridges burned yet. It's still an option for the future, which is good.
I can't help but notice that there is actually a special quality in discussing Iraq with a British accent. But let's get to the next question. Doug.
No British accent. Doug Oliphant from New America. I think this panel's done a really good job in highlighting what's new in Iraqi politics. I mean, the alignment between the KDP and Tehran, I think, is a real wave that is going through Iraq that hasn't hit Washington yet. We're still seeing editorials about the Washington-aligned KDP. But also the Sadrists as the Saudi-backed party is new. I heard that from a lot. And I think to a lesser extent, Hikmah is kind of the Switzerland, talking to everyone, but not beholden to anyone either. What I was hearing when I was in Baghdad, and Nusayba, I heard you echo it just a little bit, was kind of magical thinking about the U.S. relationship with the Iraqis. Because I heard exactly what you were saying, that, we want a new relationship with the U.S. We want the U.S. to pay attention, but we don't want occupation. I'm like, okay, fine. What are you going to do differently? What are you going to do differently to give us something that we care about? And Nusayba, I wish the United States cared about delivery of services in Iraq. I don't think there's any constituency here. We care about our training mission in Iraq, and we care about Christians in Iraq, and I think number 3 is like a very, 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 very distant third. So...
But we care about stability. Ish.
But I think we care about it through the training mission and through government formation. How do we get us to a place where either the United States can find some other interest in Iraq, or we can convince the Iraqis to show us another interest in Iraq? How do we get them to do something different so that there's another basis for a relationship with Iraq? So it's not just the same 10 of us who are going to Iraq year after year after year. They need to make new friends. I see no indication that they're doing something different to make that happen.
All right.
Thank you. Who wants?
Looking at you, Nusayba.
Yeah, so...
He's targeted you.
The Iraqis are so bad at this. Because this is how they show up to a meeting. You haven't given us enough. It's like this. It's like starting from a place of ingratitude. This is where they need to learn from the Kurds, because the Kurds have this down, right? They show up to a meeting and it's, thank you for your assistance in helping us to defeat ISIS, and we appreciate everything you've done. And, people, this kind of thing matters, but there's the expectation and the entitlement that so many senior Iraqi officials show up to these meetings with U.S. officials with. It's not helpful. And, it doesn't help to build real relationships of trust and of cooperation. And you're right. I mean, you've diagnosed the problem exactly. Now, if we knew what the solution to this was, we'd be in a very different position. Look, the administration, I think given the administration that we have, I think the argument to make is that you're very, very focused on your Iran policy, right? On your direct Iran policy. And you have all of these different ways in which you're trying to put pressure on Iran. Why isn't your Iraq policy a component of your Iran policy. Iraq is hugely strategically important to Iran. It's economically important to Iran, and it's a place in which there is, there is an opportunity to help to insulate Iraq from some of the more damaging activities that the Iranians pursue regionally. So why not kind of incorporate your Iraq policy into a wider policy that you really care about? Now, I feel like Mike is going to completely contradict me on this and say what we should absolutely not do is make Iraq into a center of Iranian-US competition. But I think, in terms of getting the attention of this administration, looking at it through the lens of what their priorities are for pushing back on Iran regionally, on advancing US influence in the region vis-a-vis Iran. I think that it's a way to get attention. Obviously, you have to be very delicate with what the potential implications are for the Iraqis.
So, one idea is, why don't we foster competition between Iran and Iraq economically?
Yeah.
Which is fair game, right? Who's not allowed to compete with somebody else economically? They are competitors on oil and gas. They are competitors in other ways, potentially. Iraq's had a raw deal for decades. Its OPEC quota stolen from it. So, why not let's focus, what about a north-south energy corridor in Iraq? What about something that could bring gas from the Gulf to Turkey and thence to Europe? Why not? The pipeline infrastructure would be reasonably easy to do. Could that be possible? Wouldn't that might put Iran's economic requirements at odds with Iraq's, and in a way that's completely fair game. But I tell you, it's not easy selling energy projects in Iraq. This fits with your idea, right, of how difficult it can be sometimes incentivizing things in Iraq. So at the energy conference in Berlin last year, the oil and gas conference, or it might have been earlier this year, a senior official from the Ministry of Oil stood up and he said, "Let me show you this chart. This is a chart of government take in oil and gas contracts everywhere in the world." And he says, look, Iraq has the third highest government take in any oil and gas contract in the world, meaning that we are basically the third best at stopping companies from making a profit in Iraq, right? He's like, it's the third least profitable place to invest in the world in energy. But don't worry, because we're going to make it number one. He said he was going to make Iraq number one for government take and the least profitable place for oil companies to work in the world, and that was his ambition. And the reason is because he's playing to his Baghdad base, where people still believe that foreign companies make bazillions and bazillions of dollars, that they have gold toilet seat covers, that's the world they live in, where they think everyone else is making money except for them. Whereas in reality, it's getting harder and harder to sell a project in Iraq every single day.
That mentality is actually rooted in the Iraqi education system. People, we used to study that kind of rhetoric in school. Genevieve.
I just wanted to say briefly, I agree with Nusayba. I mean, when people said, so how do we get Washington's attention? I said, well, they need to look at, Baghdad through the prism of Tehran. I mean, that's the way to get Washington's attention now. However, I think that we have to keep in mind that if the Iranians are squeezed too much in Baghdad by the United States, they also have other ways of retaliation, and that's military retaliation. We haven't really talked that much about that, but about this issue. But the Iranians, the Revolutionary Guards control militias inside Iraq, and they can easily use these militias in ways that are very imaginative to retaliate against the United States, or United States interests, I should say, if they feel that there's a direct kind of confrontation and Iraq is the battleground.
We have time for one last question. Bayan Khan at the end. Last row.
Thank you, Kag Bilal, and thank you to all the panel. It's been a very interesting discussion. I'm Bayan Sami Abdurrahman. I'm the KRG representative to the US. I'd like to make one comment and then ask a question. My comment is that I would dispute the extent to which it's been portrayed here today that the Kurdish leadership or the Kurds are cozying up to Iran. We have always had relations with Iran, with Turkey, with Syria at the time, because they are our neighbors and we have no choice. So the relationship with Iran has been there. I don't think we're pivoting towards Iran at the expense of the US. We get training for our Peshmerga from the US. The US still leads the coalition against ISIS. They had the ceremony to open the largest consulate in the world in Erbil just about a month ago, and so on. So we do have a relationship with Iran, but I would dispute that we're pivoting towards Iran at the expense of the US. My question, and perhaps it's for Mike, but of course to anybody, it's really about the disputed territories and security there. Since the referendum and the retaking of Kirkuk and other areas by Iraqi forces and the militias, security there has deteriorated significantly, and you touched on this. The KRG has been calling for a joint security mechanism in those areas for months now, many months, that we would have the Peshmerga with Iraqi security forces, not the PMF, and some kind of coalition presence. It doesn't have to be a physical presence. These days, you can have a virtual presence. This is something that we have asked for repeatedly, and I think the need for it is increasing every day, but I'd be interested in the panel's view on this suggestion. Thank you.
All right, so I think this is one we should have a full discussion on, and probably will have a full discussion on, of this kind of scale, because, you know, there's not just fertile ground in northern Iraq for a joint security mechanism, there's a necessity for it. Where does ISIS always grow back the fastest? It grows back in the crease between federal Iraq and the Kurdistan region, because there's lack of cooperation along those lines. And now we have the additional problem of lack of cooperation between KDP and PUK even on these kind of counter-terrorism issues. So it's vital that that happens. I think, you know, there's some areas where the Kurds, even if offered a joint security mechanism, would not go out into. I mean, places like Hawija, Western Kirkuk, probably Kurds aren't going there ever, even if somebody invited them to go there. There are other places where they want to get back into, but it's fair to say the ISIS threat is not that significant yet, like Kirkuk City. But Kurds would be very useful to have in those areas, not just because they have partial Kurdish population or very large Kurdish populations, but also because the Kurdish intelligence services have a fingertip feel for how things really work in these areas, and that clearly has been lost since last September. There was a moment in sort of September, October, when you could say, you know, let's just say 78% of Iraq had been liberated from ISIS. Well, for a couple of months, that percentage went down. We actually liberated a whole bunch of areas by forcing the Peshmerga out when the Iraqi security forces were not ready to step in. And that still remains the case along that crease right now. So, yeah, there's a very good case for joint security mechanisms in the Nineveh Plains, in Makhmur, in some parts of western Kirkuk, like Dibis district, in a lot of areas around Duz Hamatu and northern Diyala province, and, you know, maybe in some areas around Zumar and stuff like that.
We need to conclude this. Our time comes to an end, but please join me in thanking the panel very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for joining.